Hello, BookTube. You know, Peg was doing so well. We knew her as a full-blown book prize addict, chasing after every award, looking down every long list, going to her library and finding the books and reading them. And like so many addicts, she found her life to be largely empty. She read too many books that were long-listed, short-listed, or even won major literary awards that were horrible to allow her to maintain the illusion of the glamour of it all. So she eventually walked away. She walked away from her addiction. She started knitting and talking on the porch. And everything was peaceful and tranquil, but BookTube. When the major award season rolls around, all of a sudden, the strongest wills can break. And now, what do we find at Peg's channel? We find her skulking around in the shadows at Stockholm and New York at the Javits Center, saying to passersby, "Hey, buddy, can you spare a Pulitzer?" She has become a book prize addict again. And this time around, it was the National Book Award that did it. She's been feverishly following the categories as the long lists are announced. And she let translated literature go by without a peep in my email, and she let poetry go by without a peep in my email. But when she saw that nonfiction was going to be announced today, I got a peep. I got more than a peep. And I guess that's understandable, since I bang on about nonfiction all the time on this channel. And I also want to say just a tiny word in Peg's defense that being a book prize addict is also understandable. We know well, we're all bookworms here. It's largely neglected life. Our big concerns, the things that drive us crazy, stickers on the cover of books, for instance, are not understood by the rest of the world. But when a major literary award comes around, all of a sudden we're nudged a little closer to the limelight. And that's fun. It's reasonable to assume that major book prizes get more people interested in at least the idea of reading a book now and then. This lifeline, this thing that we all eat, sleep, and breathe, is largely untouched by the rest of the world, and major book prizes try to bridge that divide. But anyway, so Peg the book prize addict asked me if I would take a look at the long list for nonfiction and dilate a little on them, and I'd be happy to, especially since I've read every book on the list. I've read every book on the long list this time around. So I want to read them to you first. It's 10 books on the long list. One Person, No Vote by Carol Anderson. The Indian World of George Washington by Colin Calloway. Directorate S by Steve Cole. Brothers of the Gun by Marwan Hisham and Molly Crabapple. American Eden by Victoria Johnson. The Tangled Tree by David Quammen. Heartland by Sarah Smarsh. Call Them by Their True Names by Rebecca Solnit. The New Negro by Jeffrey Stewart, and We the Corporations by Adam Winkler. Those are the 10 books on the long list for nonfiction. Later in the week, I think on Friday, tomorrow, the fiction long list will be announced. That's the only thing anybody cares about. That's the only thing that most people are even going to even consider reading. And, of course, I'm dreading what will be on that list. And I was a little part of me was dreading this long list for nonfiction as well. And I think the key to remember when going through a list like this is that it could have been much worse. It could have been much, much worse. So, there are some items on here, there are probably a good solid third of this list, are intensely worth your time. And that's great. That's fantastic whether one of those wins or not. That's just good for everybody. So I want to go through them here. We'll just go through them down the line, since I don't know how many of them we saw on this channel. Quite a few, I would bet. But I've read them all, and the first one is One Person, No Vote by Carol Anderson. It's all about voter suppression, especially in two key districts of two key states. But she also goes into the history of voter suppression throughout the South, black suppression, the suppression of the black vote. And it's explosively relevant, and she knows that. She writes the book with one eye on that. Because in the 21st century, the Republican Party has embraced vote suppression wholesale. They've seen the same polling and demographic information as everyone else. They know that they can't sustain power unless they do one of two things: either broaden their party's platform to appeal to a broader demographic base, which they absolutely will not do because their demographic base is billionaires. I don't agree with Bernie Sanders on much, but when he talks about the billionaire class, he's completely right. And the only other way, if you're the Republican Party and you aren't willing to do option 1, then you have to do option 2, which is to make it harder for the people who aren't going to vote for you to vote at all. Carol Anderson does a really good job with this book. It's infuriating reading, not for anything of her fault, but just because you get to see just the systematic, that you get to see whole careers, politicians in the last 60 years, whose whole guiding principle and aim and ambition from the minute they set out for public life was to suppress votes, to disenfranchise voters. Imagine having that as the goal of your life, and a lot of success to claim before you crawl into your grave and spend the rest of eternity roasting in hell. So, as a work of rabble-rousing nonfiction, I recommend it. The next one is The Indian World of George Washington by Colin Calloway. I think we saw it on this channel. I don't think I ever came back and talked about it. And it's a tough one to talk about because some of you may remember, I'm a little touchy on the subject of George Washington. He is the object of so much unmitigated hero worship and swill in American history that I just don't even know where to start. So when a new book about him comes along, there are about 6 major ones every year, I just expect the worst. And I went into The Indian World of George Washington expecting the worst, but Colin Calloway is a hell of a historian. This is a meaty, substantial book, and it forces me to do a weird balancing act, because the book is really substantial, a really complex and multifaceted look at George Washington's relationships with the American Indians that he knew throughout his life, from a young surveyor to a young general to a middle-aged general to president, as a performance of history, searching through the documents and whatnot, and also keeping a narrative beat up throughout a fairly long book. It's tremendously good, but it tries to paint a balanced portrait, purporting to tell you that it will tell you without fear or favor when Washington was good to American Indians and when he was bad to them. And the problem with that is that he was never good to them. So if you set out with that as your goal, and you value the appearance of being a balanced author, your book is going to lie. And The Indian World of George Washington does frequently lie. Washington was never faithful to anyone, but especially not to anyone that didn't look like him. And he never met an American Indian without taking advantage in some way, any way that he could. And when he was in a position of authority, he never agreed to any treaty that he had even the smallest intention of honoring, and never honored any of them. So his life, the author is correct, his life was bounded on all sides by his relation with the native peoples of this continent, but always negatively, always deceitfully. And if you dig into the details of even the positive interactions that Calloway writes about, you will see that. You will see that in the fine print of his endnotes or even the fine notes on the page, you will see, oh, okay, so you're saying that he meant well, but they still got shafted. So every single time. So I don't really know how to recommend the book. As a contentious reading experience, yes. As anything to rely on, no. And that feels like the kiss of death to say that about a work of history when this is otherwise reliable. It's an impossible job. The author set himself an impossible job. So it's a tough call. The next one is Directorate S by Steve Call, who some of you will know as the author of Ghost Wars, the brilliant book called Ghost Wars. This is about American counterintelligence and deep operations in Afghanistan and Pakistan. It's blistering with details, and he goes deep into this it's a big book, and he goes deep into the weeds on the subject of murky areas that even some of their participants don't understand completely. And the result is, Call is a brilliant writer, but again, it's a tricky thing to recommend. It's so wonky. I reviewed it. for a national newspaper. But even so, I had a hard time doing that because, as some of you know, if you follow my reviews instead of just this channel, you know that I very much prize my job as your advocate. My whole philosophy, if you want to call it that, for book reviewing, is to talk directly to my readers. If you put all of my venues together, I have a fairly large audience of people who look for my book reviews, and I make sure my goal is to tell you whether or not you will enjoy reading the book, whether or not you will get something out of it, which means that I usually don't recommend books like Directorate S. I read them, but I usually don't recommend them. Like just a couple of months ago, I read a forthcoming book on political intrigue in North Africa during World War I. And I thought it was really, really good, groundbreaking. It will be referred to in every subsequent history of the area and the subject. But I couldn't recommend it to anybody, except someone who'd read as much about World War I as I have. And there aren't many people in the general reading population who have bothered to do that. So Directorate S is the same way. It's a tough recommendation, like The Indian World of George Washington. It's really, really good, but it will baffle most readers. I'm kind of surprised to see it on this long list. Surprised and encouraged, I should say. The next one is Brothers with a Gun by Marwan Hisham and Molly Crabapple, which is about the Syrian civil war. It's about the war in Syria, which has produced a large number of terrific books. They rip your heart in two, but they are fired with inspiration. And this is one of them. I don't think that it's one of the best ones from the time period under consideration for this long list, but still really good and really accessible. The next one is an odd choice. I'm surprised to see it on here, despite the fact that it got a fair degree of reviews, and that's American Eden by Victoria Johnson, which covers a wide range of insider baseball stuff in the era of the American Revolution. The aspect of it that I took away that I really liked the most is that it concentrates on the fact that there were no hospitals to speak of. There were no doctors to speak of. Most of the medical practices and prescriptions in the 1760s or the 1750s were exactly the same as they were when, during Hippocratic times. They were exactly the same as they've been for 2,000 years. And there was a incredibly strong and vital folk medicine subculture. In fact, I wouldn't even call it a subculture. It was mostly what people turned to. And the thing about that is that it consisted of a large amount of stuff that you could grow in your back garden. Keep in mind, this was a time when everybody had a garden, and not decorative either. They had it because it very much supplemented their eating. And the strand of the book that I found the most interesting, that could have been, I think, a book on its own, was that strand, that people were not only growing their own food, they were growing their own medicine. That was fascinating, but I don't see this book I think about all the books that aren't on this list for nonfiction. Ben Fountain's Beautiful Country Burn Again is brilliant. The Fall of Wisconsin is brilliant, and they're not on here, and I think they're better than American Eden, but its presence on here is a little strange. And the next one is The Tangled Tree by David Quammen. This is an author I have praised on this channel many, many times. I've also praised this specific book, many times. It's brilliant. Everything this author does is brilliant. This one is about an idea that has sprung up in the last 20 years that is gaining parlance and gaining momentum to completely rewrite our idea of how biological inheritance works. It's called horizontal gene transfer. And it upends the normal idea of gene transfer, where the information is transmitted by genes through natural selection, through inheritance. So if you are an offspring, you get your genetic material from your progenitors and nowhere else. And the idea that something could come in from the side, something come in horizontally, is only now gaining ground. And it turns out that if some of the findings in the Tangled Tree are correct, the amount of information, genetic information, that you get sideways from viruses and bacteria and whatnot is enormous. And it calls into question everything. It calls into question even who you are as an individual. If your genetics can't tell that, then what can? It's fascinating. This book is fascinating. I have a feeling that David Quammen always likes deep background. He always has in long books that he writes like this. He loves deep background, which leads me to think that there's a lot of biographical information about trailblazing biologists in this book that most readers will find excessive. Quammen wants you to know these people as people, not just as scientists. So he goes on at great length about their personalities and their biographies, and maybe too great a length for a lot of readers. The scientific information, though, nobody does it better than David Quammen. As I've said, in conjunction with many books, in many videos on this channel, nobody does it better. He is a teacher nonpareil. It's just incredible. And he will explain to you horizontal gene transfer and all that it implies for the future. Because it's not just in humans that we're talking about, obviously. I've mentioned this before, that bacteria, viruses in hospital settings, for instance, can transfer genetic information sideways. They can transfer it directly to each other without propagating a new generation, which means that resistance to ordinary drugs, to ordinary antibiotics, is skyrocketing all around the world. Because this information, once it's there, doesn't have to be propagated. It doesn't have to be passed down. It can be just handed over. Terrifying stuff. And Quammen's book covers some of that. My caveat about the book is that I'd be willing to bet that a lot of readers would think they could have stood with a lot more of that and a lot less of how much some of the scientists like bowling. So there's a weak spot of an otherwise great book. The next one is Heartland by Sarah Smarsh. It's another in a long string of books like Nickel and Dimed about people who simply can't make ends meet in modern America. They've husband has a job, husband maybe has two jobs, the wife has a job, and yet the bills keep mounting and the money goes, covers less and less with every year. And I liked the book. It's told with a lot of heart. I have a fundamental objection to a lot of these books, especially in the 21st century, that makes me sound heartless. But nevertheless, the people who are often profiled in these books, a lot of times in this book, more times than a couple of other books I can think of, their money isn't covering all of their expenses in large part because they are mindlessly piling on expenses that were normal in the 1950s. If you are both graduate students in your early 30s or late 20s, and you decide, okay, the husband has now got a job, the wife just got a job, they've both been interviewing, and they both got jobs, phew, great, so we will be able to pay down our student loans. And we know what our jobs are, and we know what they pay. And we know that if we budget correctly and we live within our means, we can afford a nice apartment in a nice part of town and pay down our student loans. Okay, fine. In books like this, far too often, that couple looks at those bottom lines, goes, whew, and then the next day says, well, okay, we need 3 cars and we obviously need 5 kids. When each kid is $700,000. So, totally impossible. And they do it anyway. And then complain to interviewers like Sarah Smarsh about how, I just can't make it in America. Well, okay. Okay. On the one hand, yes, it is entirely rotten that the living expectations for Americans in the middle class in 2018 is worse than it was in 1978. Yes, that's bad, and it'd be nice if that changed. I'm not sure how much that it can change the more the global economy becomes uniform. But one way or another, it is true. And if you get right on the edge of adulthood, and then you step off that edge and start amassing huge amounts of debt in the form of make a mansion or stuff, or children, things that you consider to be your birthright, which aren't in any way, then of course you're going to run into financial troubles. The book was really good, but I wonder if it will make you think the same thing. Then the next one is Call Them By Their True Names by Rebecca Solnit, this is a collection of essays and deadline prose, and some of it is really good. A lot of it annoys. This is the author of a book that annoyed me to death, a book called Men Explain Things to Me, that was just dirty pool on every page. And the sum of that ranty sourpuss stuff going on in this book as well. If you make an essay about a group of people, and you characterize that group as being homogeneous, and you say that they all do a lot of negative things, and if anyone at all is a member of that group, then they do all of those things. Well, okay. If you call that group black people, then you don't get a book contract. You're ostracized from your job at a university. You don't get speaking engagements. You're a pariah. Because it's obviously racism to do that. And the point that I like to make, that I would like to make to authors like this, is that if you do that to any group, you're being a bigot. It's not just that you have to avoid a few radioactive subgroups and then you're okay. If you write a book like that about a huge group, let's say men or white people, and you say, here are a bunch of negative things that they all do, and there are no exceptions, then, fortunately, call them by their true names is not as bad as men explain things to me in that regard. There's quite a bit of really scintillating stuff here. It's an odd choice that it's an essay collection from a bunch of previously published stuff, and yet I would be willing to say that in the informal handicap, that's all we can ever do with awards, I'd be willing to say that this book is a serious contender to win for the category of nonfiction. Then the next one is The New Negro by Jeffrey Stewart, which is a 1,000-page biography of Alan Locke, the informal grandfather of the Harlem Renaissance, an amazing public figure, a teacher, a mentor to a whole generation of intellectuals, black and white. And Stewart's book is incredible. It's the gigantic biography that this figure has always needed and now finally has. And it came out at the very beginning of the year. Very glad to see that the National Book Award is remembering that 2018 is started in January. It started a long time ago. Very nice to see that. I reviewed it and loved it. I think it's one of the best works on this list. This is the last chance. Jeffrey Stewart this was the last chance for someone to meet all the people who are still alive, go through all of the documents, go to all of the places before gentrification in Harlem ruins them, destroys them, erases them. And the book benefits in every way. It's just alive on every page. I loved it. Absolutely loved it. And the last one is We the Corporations by Adam Winkler. And we end the list as we started it with a book that's really well reported, really good, and utterly infuriating. Just utterly infuriating. Because this is about Citizens United. This is about corporations are people, my friends. This is about one of the most ridiculous rulings in American jurisprudence history, that corporations have individual rights. No corporation has yet tried to push that to adopting children or going to war, but there was a string of U.S. legal cases designed very cynically on the part of the ruling cadre in power to make it possible for corporations to funnel unlimited amounts of money into American politics. That was the whole goal. It wasn't that corporations were people and needed their civil rights. It was just that. And those rulings worked. And now it has become, on progressive left circles in America, has become sort of a rallying cry for your candidate to say, I have accepted no such money. This is entirely grassroots. Remember, that was the big rallying call at Bernie Sanders during his run for the presidency, was that I'm not dealing in any dirty money. And there's now a candidate in Texas, Beto O'Rourke, he's one of many new candidates in 2018 to say there is no dirty money in my campaign at all. And this book, again, it's really well reported. It's really energetically written, but it won't do favors for your heart rate. You will be infuriated the whole time you're reading it. And that's it. That is the National Book Award long list for nonfiction for 2018. I would have chimed in anyway if Peg asked me to, but even without that, I probably would have, because it's a long list where I've read every book. If I have read a large amount of books for the fiction long list, then I'll probably chime in for that too, because Peg's not the only book prize addict, of course. I dread the long list for fiction. I dread it. I dread what it will be. This list gives me some hope. If Directorate S is on a long list, then there are real readers involved, people who aren't just looking to score, to tick off boxes in some sort of diversity bingo, I believe is how it was phrased on BookTube once upon a time. If serious books that just want to do great work are on this list, then that's great. That's great for this list. It's great for the people who will be looking at this list for recommendations, and it maybe bodes well for fiction. I'm hoping. We shall see. I think an easy shorthand for the fiction long list for the National Book Award to know whether or not it has its head up its own asteroid will be if The Overstory by Richard Powers is on there. If it is, then you can take the list seriously. If it's not, then you can't. Because no matter what you might think about the book, and I have lots of conflicted feelings on it, is one of the major. You can't leave it out if for a National Book Award for the nation that produced it in the year that it's written. So we shall see. If I have a video's worth of thoughts on it on Friday, then I will chime right in. But in the meantime, I wanted to give you an annotated version of the nonfiction long list just so you could compare notes. And I'll wrap this up for now, but I'll see you soon. Thank you, BookTube.